Today's video is going to be a little bit of a special one. We're going to take a really deep dive into illegal migration, specifically within the UK and Europe. So I won't focus on America really at all. And what I'm going to try and do is look at the causes, because there are very real causes, the effects, so trying to pull data from whatever sources I can, although the data is usually hard to find, about things like welfare in those host countries, crime by nationality, for example, or by asylum or immigration status. So we'll go through as much of that data as I can find. And then lastly, we'll look at some solutions. So I have an interview with a small political party. Other parties do exist. You can make of that what you will, but they're obviously giving their proposed solutions to this problem, or to many problems, in fact. So it took a little while for me to put this video out, and the reason for that's quite simple. The Home Office promised Rupert Lowe that they'd be giving him a batch of data covering topics like crime by nationality for the UK. Now, of course, that data never arrived, and I'm not really that surprised, but just in case they actually did follow through on their promise, that's why I wanted to wait, so that we could have more accurate data pertaining specifically to the UK within this video. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into it.
So what ignited the flood of irregular, sometimes called illegal, migration into Europe? The truth is that there have always been people fleeing to Europe illegally. For example, as the former Yugoslavia collapsed into the Bosnian War, around 900,000 Serbs, Croats and Bosnians were displaced into Western Europe. Now, this makes sense because the Balkans is situated next to the European Union. European countries really were the next safest place for these people to go.
It was snowing hard when the first convoy of refugees arrived at Bratunaj, in Bosnian Serb-controlled territory, in the early hours of the morning.
However, in 2011, everything changed. The so-called Arab Spring looked at the time to be a period of uprising in the Middle East and North Africa. Protests began in Tunisia, a response to corruption and economic stagnation.
Either this is the first Arab revolution of the 21st century, or it will be brutally suppressed.
These protests quickly spread to other countries such as Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria and Bahrain. Other countries saw unrest and protests too, but not at the same scale. Before long, these protests had become riots. Now, many of these uprisings were subsequently put down in their respective countries by the use of military force, but in a few key places, civil war broke out amidst the power vacuum left behind. Take Libya, for example. After the capture and killing of Libyan dictator Muammar al-Gaddafi, armed factions formed, and this led to what would be known as the Libyan crisis.
Even weapons that have been converted, we've seen rocket launchers that are used on a jet plane, converted and put in the back of a pickup truck. The rebels are simply using anything they can to try to take on Gaddafi's military because they're certainly outgunned.
Libya descended into civil war, officially ending in 2020, but with two separate factions now controlling the country. Libya is crucial to understanding the migrant crisis because the most popular route that migrants from North Africa would take is from the northern coast of Libya onto the Italian island of Lampedusa.
Nicknamed the gateway to Europe, the island of Lampedusa is the southernmost point of Italy. For thousands of migrants, it has been their first step on European soil after a perilous journey across the Mediterranean. But for years, some locals have felt overwhelmed by the new arrivals.
At around this same time, Syria also descends into civil war. Discontent at the rule of Bashar al-Assad quickly spiraled into one of the worst civil wars that the world has ever seen.
An armed rebellion emerged with weapons, funding and training from the Gulf and Europe. The regime doubled down in a fight for survival with weapons, bombs and fighters from Iran, Hezbollah and Russia. We witnessed Syria's descent into chaos firsthand in the country's second city of Aleppo as rebel fighters and regime troops battled for control.
Soon, a new group, calling themselves ISIS or ISIL, began to capture vast swathes of Iraq and Syria. You probably know this story already. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed during this war, and millions were displaced. Unlike the Bosnian War in the 1990s, the next safest countries in these wars were not European. That would be Jordan or Turkey or Lebanon. And indeed, many refugees fled to Turkey and Jordan. But many also realised that Turkey is on the doorstep of Europe, and so they continued their journey through Greece and into Western European nations.
Now, these are just a handful of the reasons that caused this spike in illegal migration from the Middle East and North Africa. There were others too, such as the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. But there were also pull factors that we need to address.
European politicians were comparatively very welcoming of refugees. Europe seemed to offer a better and more prosperous life than was available in the Middle East or North Africa. Angela Merkel, then Chancellor of Germany, famously said, "We can do this," on the topic of accepting 1 million Syrian, Iraqi and Afghan refugees.
Now, Merkel has been clear the whole time, Germany can manage this, even with 1 million refugees expected.
By 2015, however, what began as a trickle became a flood. Just 2 years before, in 2013, approximately 100,000 migrants entered Europe illegally. In 2015, that number had risen 18-fold to 1.8 million. Between 2015 and 2017, Germany alone received 1.4 million refugees into a population of just 80 million people. The numbers were staggering. What the 2015 migrant crisis showed, aided by social media, is that coming to Europe is not particularly difficult. After 2015, everyone could now easily see how crossings could be made. There was also no incentive for any country to appropriately police its onwards borders. Turkey, for example, had no incentive to prevent migrants from travelling into Europe until the EU eventually threw money at Turkey. Italy knew that despite hundreds of thousands of migrants arriving in Italy, most would travel onwards to Germany or France or to the United Kingdom. More recently, we have seen a serious upswing in the numbers of irregular or illegal migrants coming to Europe.
We know that the Syrian civil war was the big driver in 2015-16. Is it clear what's behind this current surge?
No, it's more complicated.
But it's important to remember for context that whilst I'm focused here on illegal migration, the levels of legal migration dwarf these figures. Once the floodgates were proven to be open and the routes into Europe well understood, migrants began travelling to Europe from all over Africa and the Middle East. It is difficult to truthfully assess where migrants are from. It is standard practice for illegal migrants to discard any identifying documents along their journey and claim that they are from Syria or Afghanistan. And indeed, some almost certainly will be from Syria or Afghanistan.
Now, the reason for this is simple. It's impossible to return people to the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan or to Syria. So what are the effects then onto the host population from all of this migration? Well, the effects are various, including societal and economic. But it's often very hard to determine exactly what the effects are because we never have the data released to us as the public. Now, that's really unfortunate and it's really unfair because it means governments won't make the correct decisions based on the data, but also that voters cannot make the correct decisions based on the data. And that's what it really comes down to. I think in many cases, the governments hide this data because they know that if voters really understood how terrible migration policies had been, there would be absolute uproar. Fortunately, there are a handful of sources that we can pick from European countries that start to build a pretty clear picture.
In 2017, Finland's police and crime force revealed statistics showing the relationship between sexual crimes and nationality, and the results are frankly shocking. What these figures show is that for every 10,000 Finnish people in Finland, 3.33 in 2017 committed a sexual offence. Now this sounds about right. Conversely, for every 10,000 Iraqis in Finland, a staggering 133 committed sexual offences. The figure is even higher for Afghans but lower for Syrians. These figures are a rare find and many countries will simply not publish data like this.
Okay, so if you're anything like me, you probably have the next question on your mind, which is, well, will these horrendous crime statistics decrease as second generation and third generation immigrants are raised in their host countries, presumably with Finnish or Danish values, for example? Unfortunately, we do have a source from which we can look at.
Now, we do actually have some more data. In 2015, Denmark published their overall crime statistics, and it reads as you might expect. Vastly higher crime rates from countries such as Lebanon, Somalia, Iraq and Syria. But interestingly, in most cases, crime is committed at an even higher rate for the children of immigrants. Those are second-generation immigrants. The Wall Street Journal also found that despite making up just 12.8% of the population of Germany, Foreigners were responsible for 34.7% of all crime, massively overrepresented in areas like pickpocketing, forgery, sexual assault, and even, unfortunately, murder. And here's another chart, also from Denmark, showing specifically the breakdown for violent crime committed by nationality. In black, you can see Denmark, and in the blue, you can see the crime rates for other Western nations. And then in the red, you can see the Middle East and North Africa. This is clearly not some kind of small statistical outlier, but a screaming trend. What you can infer from this data is that between 2010 and 2021 in Denmark, people from Somalia were committing violent crimes at a rate 35 times greater than those from the United States. It is unlikely that these trends exist only in Denmark, Sweden, and Germany. But as I have mentioned, countries do not like to collect or disseminate data based on nationality and ethnicity.
Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to the census, 72% of Somalis here live in social housing compared to 16% of the population overall. In answer to my written question, the department says it's exploring the feasibility of publishing benefits claimed by nationality. This is really important for a proper debate on both benefits policy and immigration policy. Can the Minister confirm that that work is going ahead and tell us when that data will be published?
The honourable gentleman will be aware that nationality and country of origin are not factors in assessing benefit eligibility. It may well be that we look to this in the future, but I would be delighted to follow up with the honourable gentleman in writing on how we will take this forward specifically.
Now, people misuse statistics all the time, and I just want to be clear that this data does not mean that every foreigner that you meet in your country is a criminal. Far from it.
Whilst 134 out of every 10,000 Afghans in Finland committed a sexual offence in 2017, 9,866 did not. So for every foreigner that you meet on the streets of your own country, the odds of them being a criminal are actually small, but nevertheless greater, according to these statistics, than native-born citizens.
But as I mentioned, government decisions and voting decisions cannot be made on the basis of certain individuals. They have to be made on the basis of statistics and data, because when you're working at that high level of government, that's really the only efficient way that you can actually manage a country. Now, crime is just one of many effects that migration has on host countries. And another is the intangible effect on the host nation's culture. It's very, very difficult to define exactly what this looks like or to quantify it, but we can see it. We can see it in examples like people in Germany calling for jihad or for a caliphate or for Islamic rule, for example. That is the denigration of the German culture.
Scharia in Deutschland, auf jeden Fall.
Würdest du die deutsche Verfassung aushebeln, wenn du die Gelegenheit hättest?
Auf jeden Fall.
Okay, danke.
Wie zum Beispiel? Wie könnte man jetzt aus Deutschland einen islamischen Staat machen? Wie zum Beispiel?
Laut den Werken ist das so, dass man, wenn man in der Mehrheit ist, wie Sie auch erklärt haben, sind wir dafür befohlen, Deutschland einzunehmen, auf jeden Fall.
Also es ist eine islamische Pflicht, auch Deutschland einzunehmen.
Auf jeden Fall.
So what is typically dressed up as multiculturalism really just means the denigration of the host nation's culture. It seems impossible to deny that the more that multiculturalism is accepted within a country, the more that country's actual historic culture is going to be weakened. In fact, multiculturalism seems to almost be a culture in itself, one which declares that no value or belief is more correct or right or wrong than any other. Now, to me, this is extremely dangerous and frankly wrong. It leads to confusion within the population about what is ethically right and wrong. Perhaps there's no such thing as ethics anymore. No belief is better or worse than any other. But it's not racist at all to suggest that your culture is better than another country or another people. Look, let me give you an example. In Iraq, they just lowered the age of consent to 9 years old. Are you really trying to tell me that our culture is not superior than the culture in Iraq, where that has been allowed to happen? There are other drawbacks too. Think about the levels of division that this creates between the left and the right. But more than that, think about all of the divisions across the globe that we've imported into our country. For example, when you have a very large population of people from Pakistan and people from India who historically do not like each other at all, we have imported some of those problems into the country. Or Jews and Muslims, for example, who historically have not got on particularly well, although many Jews will disagree with that, and there are many Arab Muslims living in Israel. I don't want to get into it all, but you can see the examples that we have on our streets showing just how fractured our society is becoming. And that is legal and illegal migration, which is causing that. Now look, I know that's a lot of negative things, so are there any positive aspects to all of this migration, illegal and legal? Well, you might be thinking that's more workers in the country. Surely that's a good thing, that could benefit the economy. Look, the ONS themselves released a paper which showed that low-skilled migrants cost the UK state throughout their lifetimes £500,000. I'm pretty sure the figure is even higher if they live till they're 90, but I can't remember the exact number. The point is this: low-skilled migration does not benefit the UK. It makes us all poorer. It makes our taxes have to go up to support all of the NHS and the welfare requirements that come with it. It's not a boon to the country. Those are just the hard facts. But what about overall GDP? Has immigration benefited our overall GDP so that our Prime Minister can brag about it on the world stage?
In the UK, for example, GDP adjusted for inflation has been stagnant for around 15 years. But in those 15 years, the population has increased significantly, which likely means that the average individual within the UK is getting poorer. Another negative effect of bringing more people into your country is that things will become more expensive. More people are chasing the same resources such as housing, and the effect of this is obviously felt within the United Kingdom.
Of course, this isn't really due to illegal migration, but to the far higher numbers of legal migration. And I say this because the cost of illegal migration is typically increased taxes or reducing welfare spending like the winter fuel allowance. I mean, think about it, it makes sense. We're spending almost £6 billion a year putting illegal migrants in hotels. So what do we have to do? Well, we have to save £1.5 billion by cutting the winter fuel allowance. And to be clear, the problem actually goes further than this. It goes all the way down to the council level. Let me give you a shocking statistic. 72.4% of Somalis in the UK are living in social housing. That is staggering when compared to 16% of the rest of the population. And what about people who identify as Muslim? And this is not Islamophobic, this is a statistic. Well, they have the lowest employment rate in the country. And we could safely assume that most of those people are first or second generation migrants within the UK. That makes sense, right? Now, I want to make clear that the purpose of bringing up this data and having a look at it is not to demonize certain groups. It's to look at the reality and face head on the challenges that we as a country and the rest of Europe too actually have. It's to stop burying our heads in the sand, actually address the problems and look for solutions. We're constantly told that immigration is a boon, it's the best thing ever for the country. But that's not really true at all, is it? The data, where we can ever find it, doesn't show this at all. And mysteriously, a lot of that data, as I said, is withheld, which makes you wonder what that data itself would actually look like. Okay, so we've spoken at length about the causes and we've spoken about the effect. But what we haven't looked at are the solutions. And I'll come on to that interview, I'll play that in just a minute. But one of the solutions to this whole thing that many people, particularly on the left, will offer is the idea of integration. Now, I don't understand this idea of integration. Are they talking about trying to integrate specific individuals from other countries into British culture? Because that is starkly opposed to the idea of multiculturalism. If you're trying to take that person and shape them to be in accordance with British values and British culture, that's not multiculturalism. That would be you asserting one dominant culture onto the country. So I don't really understand how people on the left say we need more integration and we need more multiculturalism. It doesn't make sense. Alternatively, perhaps they're talking about integrating entire other cultures into British culture. But that doesn't make sense either. These cultures have wildly different views on a whole host of things. I can go on at length about that. So that's like trying to mix oil and water. It simply isn't going to happen. It's not going to work. I don't understand this idea of integration unless you're also willing to abandon the idea of multiculturalism. Now, there is another solution, and it's a bit more radical, and it's got a name, and the name is remigration. It's a term which has moved its way into political discourse, entered the Overton window, and is now widely discussed throughout Europe. In fact, the Austrian Freedom Party, who are set to win the next Austrian election, have decided that they're going to have a remigration minister in their cabinet. Now, I'm going to let Alec Cave of the Homeland Party talk about what the term remigration really means and how it could be achieved practically. And the reason I'm going to let Alec Cave do that, and not talk through it myself, is because here in the UK at least, the Homeland Party are the party that are most seriously talking about this policy. They've defined their terms down to a fairly granular level of detail. Now, they're not the only party that are talking about remigration. Nick Tanconi, who I've also interviewed, has talked about this in the past. But in terms of UKIP, they don't have it defined and down to that level of granularity. I'm sure in time that will change, and we can talk about it, we can cover it. So that's why I'm going to let Alec from the Homeland Party give his views on remigration and how it might be achieved. The last thing I'll add is I'm not affiliated to any political party, and I'm not a member of any political party. There are people all the way across the political spectrum who I would love to interview. I would love to get an interview with Rupert Lowe, for example, from the Reform Party. That would be a big win for me. I'd really enjoy that. But I'd even interview people like Iqbal Mohammed, who doesn't have a political party and thinks that cousin marriage shouldn't be outlawed in this country. So I'll play the video. You can let me know what you make of it. Well, I'm here with Alec Cave of the Homeland Party. You're a spokesman for the Homeland Party. And one of your core policies in the Homeland Party is remigration. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what that means, what the term remigration actually means.
Well, remigration is essentially an emigration policy, which we obviously want to encourage. We've had mass immigration imposed on us. For the past 20 years, it's been very severe, but we've obviously had mass migration for many decades. It's changed the fabric of our society, it's changed the demography, it's changed the culture, and the indigenous population, we never asked for this. So what remigration is basically a policy of trying to reverse the demographic change. It's trying to reverse the immigration that has taken place. So obviously, in recent times, we've obviously got this crisis with the illegal crossings, with the small boats. All of those people, our policy is they all have to go. They have no right to be here. Obviously, we know they're not legitimate refugees, but it goes further than that. Like I say, we've had mass immigration imposed on us, so we want to incentivize these recent immigrants to basically return to their homelands so that we can be left to have ours.
And how exactly does the Homeland Party plan to go about remigration, about encouraging people to return to their homelands, as you say?
Well, there's a multifaceted approach. Obviously, you can financially incentivize people, but one of the most important things is we want to restore the primacy of the indigenous people's culture. So we want to put English people first, again, in their own country. You know, we only want to reinforce our own culture and not have these egalitarian or inclusive laws that put all cultures on an equal footing. But frankly, we don't even have that. What we actually have is a system where we actually promote foreign cultures and foreign practices to the extent that we're even willing to break our own laws just to accommodate for this multiculturalism. So we would scrap all of that. We would restore rule of law. We would restore primacy of our own culture first and foremost, and that is how we would encourage people to leave. Because if it doesn't feel like it's a country that's appeasing them and their culture, then they'll naturally want to go back to a culture that resonates with themselves.
So, as I understand it, for people who've come here illegally, it's forced.
Yes.
For people who've come here legally, it's encouraged and incentivized for them to leave.
Exactly that.
And
repeal the Human Rights Act.
That's one way of doing it. And one last question then. What differentiates the Homeland Party from other parties that are discussing this? To a small extent, I suppose, Reform, but to a larger extent, UKIP. What differentiates the Homeland Party from those parties?
So you have many other parties that obviously will talk about the problems of immigration, but the problem is they don't have robust policy to actually deal with it. One of the problems is we've had mass immigration. It's devastated the country. It's changed our way of life. Like I say, it's changed the demography. The indigenous population is set to become a minority. If you were to close the borders tomorrow, that's still going to happen. The culture has still been damaged. We are still set to become a minority. And this is unacceptable. So we want to reverse what has happened to us. And the only way you can reverse it is if you have an immigration policy, a remigration policy, to encourage these people to return. And that's the fundamental difference. They say, oh, we need to reduce immigration. We say, no, we need to stop immigration and we need to reverse immigration. And that's the key difference.
I said last question. I've got one more, and I promise it is the last question. On the topic of forcibly removing people who've come here illegally, how do you go about doing that if their host countries won't receive them? So say Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan, whichever country it may be. There aren't easy solutions to that, but what kind of things would Homeland try and do to get around that problem? It's a very difficult problem.
Well, we would obviously build up diplomatic relations with these countries, and I don't actually think it's really an issue, the idea that these countries wouldn't take their diasporas back. I think a lot of these countries have been devastated and they actually want people to come back to help rebuild. So I actually don't think that you're going to have this issue of people not wanting to take their population back. And if they already hold citizenship, what are they going to do? They're going to stop their own people coming back home?
So I guess what that policy comes down to from the Homeland Party there is deporting foreign criminals, which seems logical, honestly. And actually, in UK law, we're meant to do that anyway, but it just very rarely happens because of the ECHR. As well as that, deporting people who've arrived here illegally on boats. I think a lot of people would get behind that message. And then creating cultural and financial incentives for people to return to their homelands, people who've come from other countries. And that could be first, second or third generation people who are living here who did at one point hail from different shores. Now, I think those politics are actually going to resonate with a lot of people. It's not so aggressive that it's going to put people off, but a lot of people do feel like the culture in this country has shifted away from them. Like they're losing their own country and they're losing their own culture and they're losing their own values. In fact, I know that that's going to resonate with quite a few people because straight after I gave the interview to Alec, someone came up to Alec and was asking for a card and if he could learn more about the party. And that's just one passerby who happened to be listening. That's kind of it for the video. Quite an intense video from me. Not just me walking in a field, but you had maps and charts and an interview. So it's been quite a long process to draw all of that together. And I hope you appreciated it. I think it's a bit more educational, a bit more formal than some of my usual videos. But yeah, if you liked it, let me know. Leave a like, leave a comment, and if you're not subscribed, why not? Till the next one.